Welcome to the ACT podcast. In this episode, we think about what it means to teach science Christianly. I'm your host, Lizzie Harewood.
Welcome to the ACT podcast. This is second in our run of Teaching Christianly, a series of podcasts which will examine how, as Christian practitioners, we can apply a Christian worldview to the subjects we teach in the classroom. Today, we're going to be focusing on science teaching and asking the question, is it truly possible to teach science Christianly? There are suggestions that science and Christianity are often in conflict. Issues such as evolutionary theory, the beginning of life, origins of the universe, they often crop up. But others argue that science and Christianity indeed can be compatible. I'm pleased to say that Steph and Cathy from the Faraday Institute are with us to discuss these quandaries and then explore how the idea of holding a Christian worldview in the classroom can manifest. So welcome, Steph and Cathy. Please tell us, just to begin with, just a little bit more about the Faraday Institute and what it does.
Great. Okay, I'll kick off. So I'm Steph, and I am the Youth and Schools Programme co-director here at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, which is all a bit of a mouthful, but essentially the Faraday Institute is an academic research and dissemination institute based in Cambridge as part of Cambridge Theological Federation. And we're all about exploring the interactions of science and faith, thinking about how they can work together, and just exploring all of the questions that touch upon those different kind of ways of exploring the world. So what science has to offer, what faith has to offer, and where they meet in life. And so there are people here who are engaged in research, in theology, in science, philosophy. And then there are others of us that really love to take those sorts of big ideas and communicate them and get them out to people who don't want to necessarily sit and read an absolutely massive book on this or that. We're very excited about communicating to people of all ages, all faiths, all backgrounds, about these big questions of science and faith. So that's really what the Youth and Schools Programme here is all about.
And unlike teachers who are so busy preparing the next lesson, they hardly have time to think about anything, we have lots of time to think and think deeply about things. So as someone with a teaching background, I think what we can offer teachers is deep thoughts about things that you won't have time to think about.
Well, that really kind of hits the spot, because that's what we're thinking about today. We're going to be helping our members and those who are listening about some of those big picture questions, and then helping them to think about how they can integrate that, or whether it's appropriate to integrate that into the classroom. So Cathy, you say you spent quite a few years actually in the classroom. Can you tell us a little of your story?
Yeah, definitely. So my dad is an Anglican vicar. So I grew up in a strongly Christian home with very loving parents, and went to every Christian activity camp on offer, and was involved in the church youth group. So it was very easy for me to grow up as a Christian. And but my parents are not scientists. Neither of my parents like science or maths at all. So being a scientist is very much something I chose. I remember studying GCSE biology and hearing about the microevolution of peppered moths, and just thinking, wow, this is amazing. I really want to study this. So I studied biology and chemistry A-level and absolutely fell in love with the subject, and then studied natural science at Cambridge. I also decided to really go for it as a Christian at university. I helped lead the Christian Union, and the KICU, that might be familiar to some of you, a bizarre name to others of you, but Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union. And then worked for a Christian charity for a couple of years after graduating, and thought, what do I want from a career? I want something that's worthwhile, satisfying and fulfilling. And teaching absolutely ticked all the boxes. So I taught secondary school science for 20 years in the UK and abroad. I did get to travel with it. In state and private schools, in all-girls schools, in mixed schools, in selective schools, non-selective schools.
And Steph, what's the nature of your kind of work in particular?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about my story, just because that's where my head is at. Sorry. So I grew up in a family who are very outdoorsy, love being in nature, doing things like orienteering, camping, hiking. And so for me, I grew up with this profound love and respect for the natural world, really irritated my parents by asking a lot of questions all the time about different animals. I was absolutely fascinated by them. My number one question was probably, can I have it as a pet? So their number one comment to me was no.
Sounds like my kids.
Yeah. No one was very surprised when I decided that I wanted to study natural sciences at university, and particularly specialize in zoology and ecology. So zoology being the study of animal life on Earth, from sort of the history of life on Earth through to things like animal behavior, conservation science. So I covered a whole mixture of different subjects within natural sciences and within the biological, zoological world. And I guess what did surprise some people a bit more was that while I was doing all of that, I also decided that I was a Christian. So came sort of gradually to faith, or at least realizing that Jesus, this guy that I'd heard about previously, was actually really relevant in my day-to-day life as well. And some people then would say things like, oh, so does that mean you don't believe in the science anymore? And I get that from both sides, from scientists who didn't have a faith and from people of faith who maybe don't have as much scientific understanding. And so that really prompted me to start thinking, because I was like, well, I feel like the science and the wonder of the natural world was something that was nudging me towards questions about God, and wanting to, I had this sense when I looked at amazing bits of science or was out in nature, I had this sense in me that I wanted to sing, and I didn't know who I wanted to sing to. And in meeting Christians at university, who quite a lot of them were studying science, made me realize, well, of course I want to sing to the God that's behind everything that I can learn about in science. And I've spent a bit of time since then working in conservation, but gradually done more and more speaking about science and less doing any. And so absolutely love that I'm now in a job where I get to combine my love for science, my love for communicating about science, and also my love for God, and helping young people and their influencers to just really celebrate science, but also recognize that, you don't have to pick between science and faith. So
that's awesome. And that's really inspirational. It's really helpful for me as a complete layperson when it comes to science to understand what you do. But I think I also need a little bit more explanation about what science is, because as a discipline, it kind of blows my mind that you can be studying biology, chemistry, physics, and they all seem to kind of come under this banner of science. Now, my understanding is that it's kind of unpicking or understanding the way the universe works. And that does lead me to think then that perhaps that is not just a scientific discipline. Could you maybe explain what you think science is?
I can make some comments about this. That's a lovely description of science. And I knew that if I could get children to fall in love with science in the classroom, I was winning. So the curiosity, awe and wonder, which I think is done very well in lower school science. Unfortunately, GCSE science is often learn the right answer and learn what other people have found out and write it in an exam. And I would say that is not what science is. Science is finding things out that we don't yet know and making observations and then developing theories from it. But that isn't how secondary school science, particularly for GCSE, is taught. It's a much bigger thing where you ask big questions. And Steph, at the Faraday, we do that really well, don't we?
Yeah, and I guess one thing I'd say is that in the nature of science teacher training that we run, or that Cathy has developed here, a lot of that is all about exploring, well, what is science? How does it work? And that's a really good question. And one of the reasons why you need a whole course on it potentially is that people have been discussing that for as long as the word science has existed, if not longer. There is no one perfectly neat answer for exactly what science is. But when I'm working in a school and exploring that with young people, the place that I usually come to, or I find is a helpful starting point, is to recognize that science is one particular way of exploring the world. It's a really rigorous way of asking questions about how stuff works, so that, like, the mechanisms and processes behind the things that we get to see or measure in the world around us. And so it involves experiments, it involves collecting observations and data and building up a bigger and better understanding gradually of how we think the world works. And so, you get new information about how something seems to be working, and that potentially adds to or tweaks slightly that sort of big picture of sort of our scientific understanding of things. Now, that in and of itself, I would say that is science as a discipline. That is kind of what science is all about. But where that fits in sort of the bigger picture, from my own experience of studying science, it's great to be doing those like mechanism, process type questions, and you find out lots and lots and lots about how the world works, how the universe works. But it definitely isn't equipped to answer all of the questions that you might encounter and all the questions you might have about the universe. Like, why are we here? What is my meaning and purpose? What should I do with my life? And it can help explore bits of that. But you tend to find that the further you go on in science, the more you realize that it doesn't answer all of your questions or everything that you might want to explore within one question. And so that certainly for me, and I'm not alone in this, is the point where you don't just say, oh, well, science has failed me. Like, it hasn't. Science has been brilliant at doing what it's meant to do. But I'm starting to recognize that some of my questions take me beyond the scope of science.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminds me, I remember when I was at university, a writer, theologian, evangelist called John Blanchard came, and he described this kind of, and I'm going to be using the wrong terminology now, but he described the kind of biological and chemical processes of a particular event, and it was all very complex, etc. And then he said, what I've just described is what happens in my body when I look at my wife and I go to kiss her. And there was a really clear scientific explanation of processes of what happened. But he said, that's a description. It doesn't explain or explore that kind of emotional and the kind of the soul reckoning that goes on with those things.
We talked about asking students in an end of a science lesson, why is a kettle boiling? And if they've got their science heads on, they talk about the chemical or the thermal energy being converted into kinetic energy, and that means the particles can leave the water and those sorts of things. But it might just be because the science teachers want a cup of tea. And it's this thing of the mechanism and the meaning. They're both valid ways of looking at the world, and neither is wrong. They're just very different.
And it helps young people to start to see, oh, there's this question I have, and maybe why is the kettle boiling might not be their biggest question they've ever had. I mean, for me, kettles are very important because tea and coffee are very important. But it's really fun if you've been in there talking from a scientific perspective. Like, as Cathy says, they will give you some really beautiful scientific explanations for the kettle boiling. And you can really set it up and play with it and say, no, you're wrong. It's because I want a cup of tea. And then they're like, oh, wait. I'm like, well, is my cup of tea answer wrong? And they're like, no. Is it explaining something important about what's going on? Yes. Okay, but so is the science. And you're helping them to start to see that science is answering like one bit of that overall big question. And that if they accept some of the sort of meaning and purpose type answers as well, they're going to have a bigger, fuller, richer understanding of the overall thing. And obviously the kettle's a bit of a fun and silly example, but that just applies to so many of our questions. And it's really helpful if young people can see. So when we talk about limits of science, it doesn't mean like, oh, haha, science isn't everything. I mean, or like that sort of slightly like, let's tear science down or take it down a peg sort of attitude that sometimes I encounter. Like, no, science is wonderful. It's amazing at what it does and what it's meant to do, but it's one bit of the big picture. And if we can help kids to recognize that, then that's a really powerful and useful thing.
Yeah. So that brings me on then to asking about opportunities. And Steph, I know that this is basically your bread and butter. What opportunities does the studying of or the teaching of science offer to exploring particularly Christianity? Because I know you do kind of talk about faith, but I know that all of you who work for Faraday Kids, you do have your own personal Christian faith, which you particularly explore. And I know you've created resources with organisations such as Scripture Union. What opportunities does teaching science offer to exploring Christianity in the classroom, and how can that manifest? I know that's a rather broad brush picture.
Absolutely. I think when we talk to science teachers about what religious education can offer, and we call it religious education rather than religion or Christianity because it's a little bit more palatable to people without a faith. It's this ethics and philosophy and wisdom, because science can tell you the mechanics of nuclear power, but not whether it's a good thing to use. And it can tell you how a mobile phone works or how AI works, but not how to use it well and how to be wise with it. And it's not to say that non-religious frameworks can't give us ethical indications of how to do things, but our faith absolutely does. It can tell us what is right or wrong and just give us an ethical framework to answer those sorts of questions. So it's about science can tell us about climate change, but our faith can motivate us to be involved in coming up with solutions to climate change. So it's sort of how we wield this tool of science that religion or Christianity has so much to say that science can't.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it obviously depends on exactly your particular context as a science teacher as to like how far you can take any one of these different sorts of discussions. But so I went to a pretty standard state school. I loved it there, really enjoyed my science that I covered. But the thing that I used to really dislike, two things I used to really dislike in science lessons, is the sort of slightly awkward tacked on ethical considerations at the end of a lesson, which basically always seem to come across as like some religious group party pooping on what you could do with the science. And it just always felt like it came across as like, oh, but this religious group doesn't like it. And that was sort of it. That was the end of the kind of comment. And also the debates that got set up, and they always just felt so polarized, like, you know, a climate change debate, is it real, is it not real? It always just felt like sort of caricatured sorts of positions on things. And so I would say there is actually quite a lot of scope to think just a little bit more carefully about those opportunities that are there in the classroom. So, you know, if you're doing an ethics-based debate on a particular scientific big question, you know, let's say it's, what should we do about climate change? Let's say that's a big question. And as Cathy said, like the science can feed into that. Like there's a lot of scientific knowledge that explains what's going on with the environment at the moment and what might be causing some of that. And science is also really great at exploring some of the solutions that we could bring in to better protect the planet. But it's worth thinking like, well, what do faith groups have to say about whether or not we should care for the planet? How does that tie in? How can we use that to motivate people? Where does psychology come in? Because so I'm studying some psychology at the moment, and also from my experience as a conservation scientist, sometimes you look at the scale of the problem and it feels absolutely paralyzing. So how can we help people to move and free them from fear? So there's like lots of big ideas that can all feed into that. What should we do about climate change? And if you just set it up as a debate of like, well, these people over here think we should do nothing at all about climate change, and these people over here think we should be acting right now, then it's a very like limited debate. But if you create some sort of nuanced positions in it, where you look at sort of some of the complexity of people's worldviews, like, oh, I do think that humans are responsible for it, but I feel kind of powerless. You know, what would help that person to change their thinking? What would help that person to act? You know, so there's ways of sort of bringing in and better appreciating what it is that faith can contribute, what are different ways of exploring and understanding the world can contribute. So in terms of debates, it's sort of where can we bring in the nuance, and the same with sort of the ethical conversations at the end of a lesson. It's very rarely as simple as all Christians this or all Muslims that. So could we just give a little bit more spaciousness to, well, why are they concerned about this or that? What is it about their faith views that make them worry about this particular technological advancement? And does that apply to everyone of that faith? Or, you know, just find a little bit more space to introduce that it's not about party pooping, but it is about, there's some wisdom there that could be really helpful for loving people and taking really good care of people across the board. So I'd say that's where I see some of the biggest opportunities to get more directly into faith-based conversation, if appropriate.
That's really helpful, Steph, and fascinating. And we've touched on the example of climate change and some of these kind of ethical debates, and you very helpfully talked about making that perhaps more of a nuanced discussion. Cathy, do you think, from your experience, you say 20 years or so teaching science in the classroom, do you think there's space in the curriculum for some of these kind of more philosophical debates? And are they welcomed in all schools? I mean, is that part of the kind of national curriculum?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And that is the sort of thing we discuss on the training with trainee teachers particularly. I think on the one side, if people say, well, no, there isn't time in the curriculum because science particularly is a very content heavy subject, and you will do very well to get through all the content that you have to. I would say, but if you're not having those discussions in the science classroom, where are you having them?
Sure.
And people might say, well, the RE classroom, but not all students study RE to GCSE. So I would say for students' motivation and to prepare them for the world after school and not just their exams, it's imperative that science teachers do make time to discuss these things. And it doesn't have to be a whole lesson. It can just be 5 minutes as part of something that is on the curriculum really explicitly, and they will ask exam questions on. And if people say yes, oh yes, we must do this, I would say, well, you know, you do have to be realistic about how much time there is to do these things. Solutions we've come up with are possibly in assemblies, in form time, and that's sublime to ridiculous in schools, that science lessons are absolutely packed, and then form time is like ho-hum, what do we talk about? You know, put your phones away, they're allowed phones at all. So I think in form time it can be a really rich place to get some of these discussions going, even if it's first thing in the morning. You know, you can get the some of the lively members of the class, and then that gets everyone going. And also in assemblies, you can discuss these things. Again, teachers are often short of things to do in assemblies, or in PSHE, which, you know, has to be done and students often don't take seriously. But if you can get issues that they are actually studying in class or that they're really interested in, then that can get people going. So I would say, yeah, you do have to be careful with it and not take away from vital science teaching. But I'd say absolutely, for students' motivation for their lives afterwards, you've got to do it.
Yeah, and there's some other ideas again that we've tried to suggest or help people to think about, because again, science teachers and teachers full stop are so busy and under so much pressure. Like, we really want to make this easy. Some other ideas that have come up from teachers saying things like, oh, kids ask really great questions, but I don't have the time to cover them because it's just not on the curriculum and I need to keep going. So some teachers I know use a big questions box where kids can submit those questions, and maybe they can take one lesson right at the end of the year or at the end of a term to look at them, or they could even, you know, with that get creative with some of the off timetable days that exist. So could you set up a conversation between an RE teacher and a science teacher within that, to just not to necessarily debate, but to say, oh, here's this big question. What does the RE subject have to say about it? What does science have to say about it? So you're not having, as a science teacher, to suddenly be the world leading expert on RE, and the RE teacher doesn't need to have vast wealth of scientific knowledge. So how can teachers support each other in that? And also, well, what I would say is that we get invited in. This is not a plug to say invite us into all of your schools, but there are off timetable days that we get invited into, reflection days and things where we can bring in a group of different people who are scientists of faith and just spend the time exploring particular topics within science from a faith perspective with young people. And those work really well, and they are welcome in state schools. Often they tick some components of religious education. So it's worth thinking creatively about what you could do with those places where there is a bit more space. Or is there a way for you as a science teacher to link up with an RE teacher and say, have you thought about doing an off timetable day that might look like this or that? So just, I don't know, I'm just trying to encourage a little bit of creativity and thinking sort of outside of the immediate limitations of a science lesson and the pressures of the curriculum.
And you talked about big questions. I'm wondering then, what are some of the most common questions that children will ask about science that could then have some relation to faith, questions of kind of eternal significance?
Yeah, I mean, when you're teaching about evolution in the classroom, you always get are we related to apes this? You know, so you can explore that fully, and you can use it as an opportunity to show how science does work, in that these are the pieces of evidence, and this is the theory that people have developed on them, that there are questions that we can't answer, but most scientists do agree that evolution is the best way of describing the observations we've made so far. When you're teaching astronomy, they talk about, are there aliens out there? Is there another universe? And you can have some wonderful discussions again about, well, these are the observations we've made, and this is what we know from it. And it's useful, I think, to point out to students the difference between science and philosophy. Sure. So philosophy will say things like, well, there might be other universes out there. There's no scientific evidence for that yet. But students like to sort of get into that. And with aliens as well, they'd love there to be aliens out there. And again, there's no scientific evidence that there is, but it's philosophically, yes, there might be. They're some of the questions that students love asking. I know you've done 101 big questions book, which students ask, so you've got lots of questions, haven't you, Steph?
So many questions, but I do love the alien one, because if you've started to validate the questions that your young people ask that are maybe not strictly completely scientific. So, you know, a question about, well, what is the scientific evidence for aliens is a nice scientific starting point. But then you can end up springing out into all sorts of things like, well, would Jesus come to die for the aliens as well? Did the aliens need Jesus? Did the aliens believe in God? I think sometimes I find teachers who see something that I've run with their students in a lesson, they'll say, oh my gosh, I didn't know that kid had those questions in them. I didn't know that. But there's so many questions that young people have inside them. And if we validate cross-curricular questions, even if they make us feel a bit uncomfortable or not all of it is our area of expertise, then you will encounter some absolutely huge questions from kids. I mean, some of the most common ones I tend to find are questions to do with suffering. Because as soon as you start talking natural world, you're into natural disasters, you're into parasites, cancer, lots of things that we can look at from a scientific perspective. And that automatically, for all of us, brings up big wrestling with, well, why do those bad things happen? Why is this world a bit broken? If there is a loving God, how does that fit with any of it? So that's on the more serious side. There's quite a lot of the time I'll get asked things like, do you believe in evolution, the Big Bang, name that scientific theory, or the Bible? Like, which is it that you do believe in, this or that? So are quite like you must choose type question. And they're a really it's a great opportunity to say, well, both of them actually, and get into some deeper discussion about how that could actually work. And then you get absolutely wacky, wonderful questions like, would a black hole crush Jesus? Or things like, well, why are there no dinosaurs in the Bible? All sorts of great questions come up once you get started. And yeah, as Cathy said, the reason I'm talking for far too long on this is that I've collected every single question that young people have asked in a school setting and broken them down into some categories. And then I sent out 100 or so questions, actually 117 questions, to different theologians, scientists, and got them to have a go at answering them for 7 to 11-year-olds, or exploring them for 7 to 11-year-olds in 200 words or so. So there's a book out now called 101 Great Big Questions About God and Science, and I just love it.
That sounds
those questions
absolutely fascinating, and my son would love that. So I'm going to go and look that up. Now that brings me on. So some of these questions then, you talked about creation, evolution, Big Bang. Would you say then that this is an easy one for Christian Science teachers to navigate? Because not all Christians share the same understanding of those big topics. And how can we kind of reconcile those differences when it comes to giving that Christian perspective?
Yeah, that again is a really good question. And thinking back over the 20 years that I taught science in the classroom, I've only had a handful of discussions with students where I've actually told them what I think about something of those issues.
Yeah.
And I think science teaching generally tends to be, these are the views of scientists, this is the right answer, and it doesn't lend itself in the curriculum to students understanding that people have different views on some of these things.
Sure.
So I think as a Christian science teacher, you're quite brave to go there with your view on one of these things. If you do, I would say very clearly, this is my view on this. There are other Christians who think this. There are other religious people who think this. There are non-religious people who think this. So enable the students to know that it's okay to have different views on this. And that's not something that's generally done in the science classroom. It's generally all scientists agree on the structure of the atom. This is how it is, and end of. And in my opinion, that's a weakness on science teaching. It should be, well, these scientists have this views on this, and this was the evidence, but perhaps there's something that there were scientists who disagreed with them. So for an example of that would be how the moon formed. There's not agreement between scientists on the agreed theory on how the moon formed. And that's not on most GCSE science syllabuses because of this. But it would be great if there was more on science teachers saying, well, these scientists think this, these scientists think that. You know, let's look at the evidence, you make your mind up. And then that would very easily lead on to there are Christians who think this about the start of the world. There are Christians who think this about evolution, but there are Christians who think that, and so on.
Yeah.
And I think with a lot of our big questions, there are some things that you could sort of confidently find an answer for, like science. If I drop an apple, what speed will it be at by the time it hits the ground? That sort of thing. Like, I can answer that with some level of confidence. Then there are some of our bigger, well, this is our best current understanding of how this is working scientifically. And so that's great, but we may uncover new evidence that causes us to change some of our thinking on this. And that's okay. We're allowed to change. I think sometimes the media gets very excited if scientists say something different from what they've said previously. They're like, scientists were wrong. And I'm like, well, yeah, because we're human and we're not saying we're right about things. We're saying this is our best picture currently for how we think stuff works. But then there are questions once you get into like some of the philosophy and faith where we might not ever have an answer or a neat, satisfying answer to our question. You know, if we go back to suffering, I don't think that I'm going to have a fully satisfying answer to the question of why is there suffering, or why did this happen to that person and not that person, you know. But it doesn't stop it from being an interesting thing to talk about. some of the reasons that we end up in this place where there are lots of different viewpoints on something is because it is complex and we're actually not really sure how to read that bit of scripture. And so there, we all want to read scripture well. We all want to honor God in the way that we go about interpreting the Bible and thinking about how that fits with some of the other ideas that we encounter through science and other ways of knowing. But yeah, it's that sort of, we all want to do that really well, but we don't really know how.
We do have some lovely teaching resources where we do give the Faraday view on sort of the Bible and the Big Bang, how to read Genesis. We have a resource on climate change. We have a resource on bioethics, where we do unpack these issues, but we do reach some resolution. And that's where I think it'd be useful for teachers, because we've done the thinking and arrived at a point where teachers wouldn't have time to do that.
Sure.
So
and I would say the Faraday view generally on like most things, like there are some things that everyone at Faraday has different opinions on, and that's again absolutely fine. But then there are other things where essentially we share a common thought that science and faith are not only compatible, but like mutually enhancing. They're really great for each other. And so we celebrate wholehearted faith. We also celebrate mainstream consensus science and what that has to say. And we think about how those two things can work together, fit together, what they mean for one another. For example, my background being in a mixture of evolutionary biology, conservation science, and all of that, there are questions that I have about evolution and how that fits in the God that we can read about in the Bible. But there are elements of it that I'm really, really comfortable in saying they fit for me with a rigorous and faithful reading of scripture as well. For me, those two things are not in conflict because they're doing different things. So scripture is telling me about this God who made all things, that he wants to have a relationship with me, and it's telling me very important things about how he's made that relationship possible. The science for me is getting at some of how he has worked and how he continues to work in sustaining and upholding the universe. So for me, the more science I do, the more amazed I am by that God I get to read about in scripture.
Sure. I think that's really refreshing to know that you do feel some tension, but ultimately, actually, your vocation is leading you to a deeper faith in our creator God, he acts beyond the kind of the realm of understandable observation as well, doesn't he? So finally, I'm going to ask a question. This is a bit mean of me because I'm going to ask you a question about particular tricky areas of the curriculum. So I spoke to one of my good friends who is she's a science teacher. She teaches biology and chemistry up to A-level. And she was saying that there are some issues that really require some very sensitive discussion, such as bioethics, genetic screening, but also, and this has perhaps come out more recently in the last few years, things even within science such as puberty and sex, as in male and female, gender identity, the difference between gender and sex, etc. Can you give any advice or any thoughts to Christian teachers seeking to address these tricky but unavoidable areas of the curriculum?
Yeah, again, a really good question. And I have taught two students who I know were not XX or XY for their sex chromosomes, so the standard normal sex chromosomes for male and female. One I knew about in advance and another I didn't know until after I taught. It requires huge gentleness and respect for those people, because the curriculum requires you to go there with the quality of life of people who have genetic diseases or who are not the standard sex, don't have the standard sex chromosomes, and think about whether they should have been aborted at before birth. And that's a hugely emotive issue. And I think there will be people in your classes who experience those themselves. There will be people in your classes who have loved ones, and there will be friends going having those things. just for starters. And I think it's just using this idea of respect through and through, and just sort of having in your mind, you might be teaching someone with that condition, and how would they feel in the way that you're talking, I think is the best way to approach that. And thankfully, the where I taught the student where I didn't know about the genetic condition beforehand, I went through my lesson when I found out about the things I said and thought, no, it was okay, because I was really respectful. And her friend reassured me that everything I said was okay as well. So as a Christian teacher, what I try and model, or what I tried to model, was the fruits of the Spirit, the gentleness, patience, kindness, all those sorts of things. And for me, that was a far bigger part of my role as a Christian teacher than telling them my views on a particular thing. And I think almost all my students and the staff I worked with would have known I was a Christian and would have said that I was a fairly nice person. And they probably didn't know my views on abortion, on the start of the world, and that sort of thing. And looking back, I think that was a win, because I think people remember how you treat them, not what you said. So I would say, as a Christian teacher, model the fruits of the Spirit over and above pretty much everything else, and you will probably be grateful for how you did it. Basically, no regrets.
Well, guys, it has been such a delight to have you with us on this podcast today. Is there anything that you would like to particularly kind of advise our members to look at, any of your resources that might help? I know obviously all of them, but if there's one just off the top of your head that you could highlight, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I would say look on our website and come on one of our training sessions. We do training for science teachers, training for RE teachers, training for primary teachers, and we'd love to explore these issues with you in more depth and, you know, hear your views on them. Sure. So I plug for the training, but there's also great books.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of book resources for kids. So if you look on the Faraday Institute's shop, for example, you can see our range of resources for children and young people. We're hoping to put up some of our sort of resource packages we've been developing for teachers onto there soon as well. So I'd encourage you all to check that out. And our Faraday Educators website that you can get to through the main Faraday website, again, explores some of the big questions that young people ask and gives you a little bit more detail about some of the training that we offer. And yeah, just if you've got any questions, get in touch with us. We're very, very happy to point people in directions that can get them thinking and exploring some of these, or point you in the right direction for a training session that might suit your needs. Keep exploring and celebrating science and
loving Jesus.
Loving Jesus.
Loving Jesus. Absolutely, loving Jesus. Well, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be in touch again.